She had no formal training, no record label, no industry connections, and no plan. Just a guitar, a camera, and a pandemic that had nowhere else to put her. Within months of posting her first video in October of 2020, Larissa Liveir had accumulated millions of views and a fan base that stretched across continents. Then, at what seemed like the peak of her momentum, she went quiet. No explanation, just silence. Fans started asking questions the internet couldn't quite answer. Some worried, some speculated. The truth turned out to be more layered than anyone expected, and it starts long before she ever picked up a guitar. The disappearance, nobody could explain. For a creator whose channel had been growing at a pace most musicians spend entire careers chasing, the silence was jarring. Larissa Liveir had built her YouTube presence on consistency and quality. Her videos weren't casual smartphone clips. They were carefully planned, filmed, and edited productions, full song covers and short-form riffs that demonstrated the kind of technical precision that made industry professionals stop scrolling. Her cover of Pink Floyd's Time Alone pulled in millions of views. Her version of Johnny B. Good eventually crossed 19 million. She had over 3 million subscribers and nearly 500 million total views on the platform. And then, the uploads slowed down. Weeks passed between posts, then months. The comment sections on her older videos filled up with the same questions. Where did she go? Is she okay? What happened? The easy assumption was burnout. The more alarming speculation was that something had gone wrong personally. A smaller but vocal segment of her audience suggested she had simply moved on, that YouTube had served its purpose, and she was cashing out of a platform that had stopped working in her favor financially. That last theory was closer to the truth than most people realized, but it still didn't tell the whole story. What made the absence feel more significant was the timing. She hadn't gone quiet during a slow period. She went quiet while her numbers were still climbing, while brands were still tagging her, while the algorithm was still pushing her content to new audiences. That's not the behavior of someone whose career was fading. That's the behavior of someone who was making a deliberate choice, even if the reasons behind it weren't visible to the people watching from the outside. There were also clues scattered across her social media activity during that period that most fans didn't piece together at the time. Her Instagram remained active. Her TikTok kept getting updates. The content she was posting on those platforms was less polished and more personal. Shorter clips, behind-the-scenes moments, casual practice sessions. It looked less like someone who had stopped creating and more like someone who had stopped performing for an audience they no longer felt entirely comfortable with. The YouTube comment sections, in particular, had become a space she had described in interviews as increasingly difficult to navigate. What was actually happening was a collision of several different pressures at once. A platform that was quietly working against her financially, an online environment that had turned genuinely hostile in specific and gendered ways, and a creative identity that had outgrown the format she'd built her name on. Understanding how she got there requires going back to the beginning. The girl from Minas Gerais who taught herself everything. Larissa Liveir was born on April 8, 2002 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, but grew up in Minas Gerais, a southeastern state known more for its mining history and colonial architecture than for producing rock guitarists. She came from a middle-class household where music wasn't a profession anyone was mapping out for her. But curiosity was something the household apparently had in abundance. Her entry point into music was an acoustic guitar she convinced her parents to buy for her when she was 8 years old. She had seen someone play at a school event and felt something click immediately. From the beginning, her tastes leaned toward pop and electronic music, but her teenage years pulled her in a different direction entirely. By the time she was in her mid-teens, she had discovered rock, blues, and metal, and those genres changed the way she related to the instrument entirely. At 17, she made the shift from acoustic to electric guitar. That transition marked the beginning of a more serious relationship with the craft. And here is the part that surprises most people. She never took a single formal lesson. Everything she learned came from YouTube tutorials, hours of personal practice, and the kind of repetitive self-correction that only someone genuinely obsessed with improvement would sustain. She would later describe her daily practice routine as at least 3 hours, divided between technique, theory, scales, improvisation, and learning actual songs and solos. What also shaped her playing in ways that weren't immediately obvious to international audiences was her Brazilian musical background. She has cited Baden Powell, the legendary Brazilian guitarist known for blending classical technique with Afro-Brazilian rhythms, as one of her formative influences. She spent time as a teenager experimenting with finger-picking styles and rhythmic grooves that drew on that tradition, even as her public focus remained firmly on rock and metal. She has also spoken about the work of João Gilberto and Tom Jobim as foundational to her understanding of melody and subtle dynamics. That background introduced a layer of rhythmic complexity into her playing that many listeners could feel without being able to identify its source. It was the thing that made her covers feel slightly different from other technically proficient guitarists doing the same songs on the same platform. Before any of that translated into a career, she enrolled in engineering school. Then she switched to architecture. Neither stuck. Not because she wasn't capable, but because the guitar kept pulling her back harder than any academic program could hold her. How a pandemic built a career overnight. The circumstance that launched Larissa Liveir's public life was not one she engineered. When the COVID-19 pandemic shut down Brazil in early 2020, she found herself at home with suddenly open stretches of time and no engineering or architecture classes to fill them. She opened a YouTube channel on April 23, 2020, though she didn't upload her first actual video until October of that year. That first video was titled Guitar Hero on Real Guitar, a concept simple enough to travel instantly across the internet. What set it apart wasn't just the technical skill, though that was immediately obvious to anyone who watched it. It was the presentation. Larissa had thought carefully about how the videos looked, not just how they sounded. She wore costumes and makeup that matched the mood and era of each cover. She understood intuitively that YouTube was a visual medium first and an audio 1 second, and she produced accordingly. That combination of genuine musicianship and visual intentionality was rare enough on the platform that it cut through almost immediately. The growth was almost immediate. A cover of a Guns N' Roses track pulled in over 2 million views within a single month. Her Pink Floyd covers became the kind of content people shared with their parents and their teenage kids simultaneously, which is an unusually wide audience for a solo guitarist on YouTube. She reached 1 million subscribers within her first year, a milestone that takes many creators 5 years or more to hit. Within 2 years, she had crossed 3 million, a number that placed her among the most followed independent guitarists on the entire platform, regardless of gender. She wasn't just covering songs, though. From early on, she was teasing original riffs and compositions in her videos, signaling to anyone paying attention that the covers were a showcase, not the destination. Her videos, as she put it in an interview with Guitar World, were essentially demo tapes, designed to display her range and versatility to anyone in the industry who might be watching. That framing was deliberate and turned out to be accurate. The industry was, in fact, watching. The speed of that growth created its own set of complications. When an audience doubles, and then doubles again within months, it stops being a community of people who found you organically and becomes something harder to manage. Comments from strangers who had discovered her through algorithm recommendations rather than through a genuine interest in guitar playing started to outnumber responses from her actual core audience. The ratio of engaged, musically literate fans to casual viewers drawn in by thumbnails and autoplay shifted significantly. That shift in audience composition changed the texture of the comment sections in ways that would become increasingly relevant to her later decision to pull back from the platform. What also changed was the nature of the pressure. In the early months, uploading felt like sharing something she would have been doing anyway. By 2022, it had become a production cycle with expectations attached to it. Fans had grown accustomed to a certain frequency of uploads and a certain level of production value, and maintaining both simultaneously was a full-time job that left little room for the kind of unhurried, exploratory practice that had made her good in the first place. The pipeline was running, but the thing feeding it was quietly being used up. By 2022, she had partnerships with Marshall, Gibson, Epiphone, Schecter, Ernie Ball, Edifier, and Lava Me, a roster of endorsements that most professional guitarists spend a decade building toward. She was being written about in Guitar World, Guitar Thrills, and Femme Metal. She had arrived, at least by the metrics most people use to measure arrival. The question was whether the structure she had built could sustain the weight she was being asked to put on it. The machine that turned on her. Here is the part that doesn't make it into the highlight reels. Behind the growth and the endorsements and the subscriber count, Larissa was running into a set of structural problems that had nothing to do with her talent and everything to do with how the platforms she depended on actually worked. The first problem was financial. Despite accumulating hundreds of millions of views on YouTube, the vast majority of the earnings generated by her covers flowed directly to the original rights holders, not to her. That is simply how copyright works on the platform. When you cover a song by Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, the royalties from any monetization go to the publishing and record companies that own those compositions. Larissa's labor, her planning, filming, editing, and performing produced revenue she largely could not keep. The brand partnerships helped offset this, but they didn't eliminate the underlying math. Creating high-quality content at the rate her audience expected, while seeing most of the financial return go elsewhere, was a model with a ceiling that she was approaching faster than her subscriber count suggested. The second problem was the comment sections. Larissa had spoken about this publicly, and it's worth taking seriously because it describes something that affects far more female creators than ever admitted. A persistent segment of her audience refused to engage with her work on its own terms. Instead of discussing her technique, her tone choices, her phrasing, her growth as a player, they reduced her entire presence to her appearance. The argument, repeated in comments across platforms, was that she was only successful because she was physically attractive, that her talent was secondary or even irrelevant to her numbers. She addressed this directly and with composure, pointing out that she dedicated several hours daily to practice, and that anyone actually watching her videos could evaluate the playing for themselves. But addressing it and being unaffected by it are two different things. The comments kept coming, and over time, they changed the texture of showing up online every single week. What made that particular criticism especially frustrating was its circular logic. The same people dismissing her talent were also watching her videos, inflating her view counts, and contributing to the algorithmic visibility that attracted brand partnerships. Her success, in other words, was simultaneously being used as evidence against her while also being built on the engagement of the people making that argument. There was no winning that conversation, and she eventually stopped trying to have it. She has said in more recent interviews that she reached a point where she simply stopped reading certain sections of the comment threads altogether, not out of fragility, but out of a practical decision to protect the mental space she needed to keep creating. She has also been open about the perfectionism that defined her production process and the toll it took. Every video she uploaded represented days of work. She would film multiple takes of the same section, edit with a level of precision that most casual viewers would never notice, but that she would, and then second-guess the final product anyway. That cycle, repeated week after week to feed an algorithm that rewarded quantity as much as quality, eventually ground her down in ways that went beyond ordinary tiredness. It became a pattern where the thing she loved most, actually playing the guitar, was being buried under the administrative and emotional labor of being a content creator. The playing was becoming incidental to the production, and that inversion was something she found genuinely difficult to sustain. The third problem was the format itself. YouTube had built her name, but it was also increasingly expensive to feed in terms of time and creative energy. Her perfectionist tendencies meant that a single video could consume the better part of a week between planning, filming, and editing. The platform's algorithm rewarded consistency, but consistency at her quality standard was genuinely exhausting to maintain indefinitely. Meanwhile, Instagram and TikTok offered shorter formats, more direct audience feedback, and a community that she found considerably less hostile. She began shifting her energy there, which was a rational response to the environment she was working in, but it meant YouTube saw less of her, and her subscribers noticed and said so loudly. Honeybomb, the exit, and what she's building now. In 2023, Larissa made a move that looked, from the outside, like a natural expansion of her career. She joined Honeybomb, an all-female Brazilian rock cover band, as lead guitarist. For someone who had spent years performing solo in front of a camera, joining a band represented something genuinely different. Real-time collaboration, live performance energy, and the kind of musical conversation that a solo YouTube setup simply cannot replicate. Playing with other musicians forced a different kind of listening and responsiveness than recording alone ever required. And that challenge was clearly part of the appeal. She had always said she wanted to join a band before she turned 25. That goal was something she had spoken about in interviews, framing it less as a career strategy and more as a personal milestone, a proof of concept that she could hold her own in a live group setting, not just in a controlled recording environment. Honeybomb gave her that, and by most accounts, the experience delivered what she was looking for in terms of live performance and collaboration. The band played shows across Brazil and built a following of their own, separate from the audience Larissa had accumulated through her solo channel. But she left a year later. The stated reason was a desire to focus on her own projects, and there is no reason to doubt that framing. Her solo identity had always been her primary platform, and the original music she had been teasing for years was still waiting to be made. Staying in a cover band, however talented the members, would have kept her in the same creative lane she had been occupying since 2020. The covers had opened doors, built the audience, and demonstrated her range, but they had also, in a sense, become a ceiling. Every month she spent playing other people's music in a band was a month she wasn't developing the original catalog that she had been talking about building since her earliest interviews. The decision to leave tracked clearly with someone who was starting to move toward the next chapter rather than consolidating in the current one. What that next chapter looks like is something she has been deliberately careful about revealing all at once. She confirmed in a 2024 interview with Guitar Thrills that she was actively working on original material. She referenced plans to explore the Brazilian musical legacy she grew up adjacent to, including potential collaborations with local musicians and the incorporation of traditional Brazilian instruments like the cavaquinho into rock-oriented tracks. The influences she named, including Baden-Powell's blend of classical technique and Afro-Brazilian rhythms, suggest that the original music, when it arrives, will carry a depth and cultural specificity that her covers, impressive as they were, never quite had room to express fully. Her numbers tell a clear story about where things currently stand. She has over 3.3 million YouTube subscribers and nearly 500 million total views on the platform. On Instagram, she has crossed 2 million followers. On TikTok, she has over 1.2 million followers and 8.4 million likes. Her income now comes from a combination of brand sponsorships, platform revenue, and direct fan support through Patreon, which she has encouraged her audience to use as a way of funding original music, rather than subsidizing covers that funnel most of their earnings elsewhere. Her net worth is estimated at somewhere between $1 and $3 million, though the wide range in those estimates reflects how much of her actual revenue comes from brand deals and partnerships that are not publicly disclosed in detail. The YouTube slowdown, which is what triggered the concern from her audience in the first place, turns out to be less of a disappearance and more of a deliberate and considered recalibration. What remains consistent across all of it is the thing that made people pay attention in the first place. She still practices for hours every day. She still approaches each video as something worth doing well rather than just doing quickly. She still describes the guitar as the central organizing fact of her life, less an instrument than a language she thinks in. The girl who started posting videos during a pandemic because she suddenly had nowhere else to put her energy has become one of the most recognizable female guitarists in the world. Some people watched Larissa's story and saw a creator who made smart, calculated decisions at every turn. Others will watch the same story and see someone who has been grinding for 5 years and still hasn't released the original music she keeps promising. Which side are you on? Leave it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.